Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for attending the Mirantis KaaS European webinar. My name is Daniel Virassamy. I'm one of the cloud solutions architects working for Mirantis. I'm based in Paris. Previously, I worked for multiple French companies and mainly in the telco world. So that's my background. Before we go through the KaaS product presentation and then the demo, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, you can use the question window on the GoToWebinar application, and then we'll happily answer them at the end of the session. You will also receive a link of the presentation, and we will share the recording of the session during this week. So what is on the agenda this morning? At least my morning. What is our definition of open cloud? How does it relate to Mirantis Kubernetes-as-a-Service? I will be doing a demo overview and then running the demo, and at the end of the session we'll have Q&A. So what is Mirantis' definition of open cloud? For us, open cloud is based on three main very important things. The first one is what is a true cloud experience, and what we mean by a true cloud experience is having an infrastructure that has the ability, whether it's on-premise or on public cloud, to continuously update itself, right? So to get new features, to get bug fixes, to get security patches. The other thing about the true cloud experience is also to provide features through the self-service mode. So basically it means that developers, tenants, application owners will have the ability to consume the resources, the infrastructure resources themselves without needing to go through a complex process to get these resources available. Okay. The second thing about an open cloud is that it needs to run on multiple infrastructure. Now we have in the current cloud environment, we have multiple different infrastructure environments, whether it's private or public. And what you want to leverage is to have a consistent experience across all these different infrastructure, right? And then the last part is about using open standards. Why you want open standards? This will allow you to have workload portability, and you will get also benefit of the open source community, so rapid innovation and no vendor locking, right? This is very important. You don't want to have to be locked on one given operating system, one given cloud, and then having the ability to deploy Kubernetes only on these or a patched version of Kubernetes only on these environments. So Mirantis provides Kubernetes as a service. So this is Mirantis Open Cloud, Mirantis, so Kubernetes as a service, which is a lifecycle management system. And that lifecycle management system will allow you to deploy Kubernetes clusters across multiple environments, right? And it will allow you to deploy these Kubernetes clusters in a full stack mode, which means we will take care of provisioning hardware, installing the operating system, configuring the different services in the operating system, and then deploy Kubernetes clusters. Okay. So the three main environments that we will be supporting for the GA release are bare metal environments, OpenStack clouds, and AWS EC2. And then we have a very rich roadmap for 2020, where we want to support also VMware on the private cloud, and then Azure and Google for the public cloud, right? So we'll then support all these different environments. On top of that, you will have the Kubernetes as a thin layer, right? And then on top of these Kubernetes clusters, you will have the ability, sorry, you will have the ability to deploy multiple type of workloads, container workloads, but also virtual machines or manage bare metal as a service. Okay, and I'll go into a little bit more details about that. The last item about the open cloud experience from Mirantis is what we call Stacklight. So Stacklight is a full stack logging, monitoring, and alerting system based on best of breed open source components like Prometheus, Grafana, Kibana, Elasticsearch. And these elements will allow you to monitor both the LCM, so Kubernetes-as-a-Service LCM, but also the Kubernetes clusters that you are deploying and the workloads that you are deploying on top of these Kubernetes clusters. Okay. So Kubernetes-as-a-Service is an infrastructure that continuously updates itself. For those of you who have already downloaded the public beta, you may have noted that we deliver the public beta in the 1.0.0 version, and then automatically you got the 1.1.0 version, and then very recently the 1.2.0 version, right? So it continuously updates itself in the background, and you then get benefit of all the bug fixes, patches, security fixes, and new features that we are delivering in KaaS. Okay. So how do we run that? Your Kubernetes as a service management cluster is connected to our repositories, and we then update these repositories. So Mirantis repositories, the manifest and the manifest repos, and then we push these modifications towards your KaaS management cluster, and then through CRD reconciliation, your KaaS management cluster and child clusters have the ability to upgrade automatically, right, or manually. The good thing is when we will be delivering, for example, a new Kubernetes version, you will then get the ability to update to that latest release of Kubernetes that we are delivering through this continuous update process. Okay. KaaS also allows you to use the Kubernetes clusters on your term. And what do we mean by this is that as being self-service, you will have the ability through one single management plane to deploy multiple Kubernetes clusters. In the roadmap, we also want to support multiple regions. So through one single KaaS cluster, you will be able to deploy Kubernetes clusters across multiple sites, geographic sites. So one single management plane to manage multiple geographic sites. And then you also have multiple flavors of the Kubernetes clusters. So the first one is a standard IT-based Kubernetes cluster where you will be deploying Kubernetes workloads. And then on top of that, you will have the ability to deploy your own Kubernetes add-ons to manage, for example, continuous integration and continuous deployment of applications on top of that Kubernetes cluster. But we are also addressing the edge use case where we have the ability to deploy highly available clusters on bare metal nodes at the edge. And we also have the ability in these Kubernetes clusters to support both container workloads, but also virtual machine workloads. Okay. And again, in the roadmap, we have a couple of features that we are working on to give more and more features around the edge and NFV use cases. We will ourselves use KaaS as an LCM and the Kubernetes cluster that we are deploying through KaaS to deploy complex applications like OpenStack and Ceph cluster. So our next release of OpenStack will be based on Kubernetes. So we'll be using KaaS as the LCM, deploy a Kubernetes cluster, and on top of that Kubernetes cluster, we will be deploying OpenStack cloud on top of that. Okay. The same for Ceph. So our next releases, and when we'll be deploying the Ceph cluster, which will be either connected to the other Kubernetes clusters or to the OpenStack cloud, that Ceph cluster will also be based on Kubernetes. Okay, so KaaS as the LCM, and then having the ability to deploy multiple Kubernetes clusters through that LCM, and then manage multiple, whether workloads, virtual machines, or containers, but also verticals when it comes to the edge use case. Right. The last thing I want to add on this slide is that for all these different environments, we always have Stacklight, and Stacklight being the logging, monitoring, and alerting system. So, as a summary, what are the KaaS benefits? The first one, and which is very, very important, is application portability. What you want to achieve is to have the ability to use standard Helm charts, standard Kubernetes manifest, and just run your applications or just onboard your applications on top of Kubernetes clusters, so that you are not in any way locked in with a single vendor. Okay, so how do we do that? Simply because we are using pure play Kubernetes. We don't patch in any way Kubernetes. We are using CNCF certified Kubernetes. Okay. So this is also related to the no vendor locking, because we are providing a flexible and agnostic architecture. We are enforcing multiple patterns when we deploy the Kubernetes cluster. We will see that during the demo. And what does it mean? It means that we offer an enterprise-grade open source solution. We do the hardening, we do the integration, and we provide a way of deploying the Kubernetes clusters in a repeatable way, resilient and scalable way, right? So you have the ability through KaaS to enforce multiple parameters, so that you make sure that the cluster that is being deployed by the application owners, the tenants, are secure and resilient. We reduce the complexity and risk because we are doing the full stack support on these different environments, whether it's bare metal environment, OpenStack Cloud, and AWS, right? So when you look at bare metal environment, for example, the only thing you will need to do is rack the server, connect it to power and network, and then KaaS will take care of commissioning the hardware, installing the operating system, configuring the operating system, and then deploy Kubernetes clusters on top of that. So, right, so it's a full stack support. And once this Kubernetes cluster is deployed on it, the whole lifecycle of the management of this Kubernetes cluster is done through KaaS. So if you want to update it or expand the cluster, you will be doing it through the KaaS UI or APIs without having to manage the complexity on the target environment itself. The last thing is zero-touch operations. Zero-touch operations in multiple ways in terms of updating. So you have the ability to update the KaaS management system automatically. So you will receive continuously these updates through the connection to our repositories, but you will also have the ability to do self-healing, and in the future, with the next releases in 2020, having the ability also to do some auto scaling of the cluster. Okay. So let's go on the demo part. Before I run the demos, I just wanted to share with you some of the online resources that we provided. So if you haven't seen it, if you go on the public beta link that we provide, you will have the ability there to register and then download KaaS and deploy the KaaS system. So we give the ability to deploy the KaaS management system on bare metal environment, OpenStack Cloud, and AWS, right? And for this, you have also the online documentation that we provide. So if you go on the online documentation, you will have multiple guides. The first one is the reference architecture, where we explain the design of KaaS and how the main components have been built. So you will have detailed explanation about KaaS LCM itself. You have the deployment guide that explains how to deploy KaaS on bare metal, OpenStack, and AWS, right? So you have the ability, or it's up to you to decide on which environment you want to deploy KaaS. And then the last one is the user guide, where you will have the ability to, will explain how to use KaaS, basically, right? So how to create namespaces, how to create Kubernetes clusters, how to troubleshoot the system. Okay. We'll share the slide, so you will have the link to these resources. Okay, so it's online, it's freemium. Feel free to download it and use it. So that's the installation workflow. You connect to the online resource that we provided, create an account, download the KaaS system, get the freemium license, deploy the Bootstrap. So basically, Bootstrap is a small Kubernetes cluster running in Docker. You can run it on your laptop. It doesn't require a lot of resources. 1 or 2, well, I think it's 4 vCPUs and 8 gig of RAM. And as from there, you will be able to deploy KaaS, Kubernetes as a service management system on your target environment, right? Target environment, whether it's again bare metal environment, OpenStack Cloud, or AWS. Okay. What I will be doing and what I will be showing during the demo is the step after this installation workflow. So I will not be showing the installation workflow, but I will be showing how to use the KaaS environment. Okay. So the scope of the demo. The first thing I want to show is how to access KaaS, right? What are the different interfaces to interact with KaaS? The second part is the definition of namespace. What is a namespace and what you can do within a namespace? The third element I will be showing is how to access and use a Kubernetes cluster that is created by KaaS. And the last item is how to use the idea button that we added on the KaaS UI to interact with our product team. Okay. So what are the roles in KaaS? You basically have 2 roles. The first one is an admin role, and the second one is a developer role. As an admin, I will be managing the deployment of KaaS and managing the resources in KaaS, like users and so user credentials and to which namespace they can connect. So the developer, the first task or the first item that the developer will be doing is request a KaaS user access to the admin team. And the admin team will then create that user account, create a namespace. So I will explain what is a namespace in the next slide. And then assign a user account to that namespace. And once all of these different items are done, the admin team will just provide the user credentials to the developer, and the developer can then consume the KaaS resources himself, right? So it's a self-service solution. So at this point, the developer will not rely anymore on the KaaS on the admin team. Okay. So for the first demo, what we will be seeing here is how to access KaaS. What are the different interfaces for KaaS? What is a namespace? How to create a namespace, and then what we can do within that namespace. Okay, so basically what we will be doing within that namespace is to create a Kubernetes child cluster and configure that Kubernetes child cluster. Okay. So once you have installed the Kubernetes as a service management cluster, you will have access to a UI, and as an admin, you will have the ability to, admin or developer, you will have the ability to log in to that UI. So here I'm going to log in as a administrator, right? So writer with the writer privileges. Okay. So the first window in which I will be connected once I'm in the system is the namespace tab. So what is a namespace? A namespace is basically a target environment. So this is where you will have the ability to actually deploy your Kubernetes cluster. So a namespace can relate to a bare metal environment. A namespace can relate to an OpenStack tenant. A namespace can relate to a AWS project, right? And in that case, you can see here that I already have a namespace created, which is OpenStack private tenant, right? And it relates to this OpenStack cloud actually, right? So this is my OpenStack tenant, Virassamy, and within this tenant, I will be creating Kubernetes clusters as virtual machines. Okay, let's see how to create a namespace. So simply click on the create button, give it a name, right? And once you have the namespace created, you only need to add the credentials so that KaaS can access that namespace and request and configure resources on that namespace. Okay, so for example, if I'm going to configure an OpenStack provider, I only need to provide the Keystone OpenRC file, right? So I will add a credential here. I will select the provider. So here you can see that I'm able to configure an OpenStack provider, but you will also have the ability to configure an AWS or a bare metal provider if you configured the KaaS system on the proper target environment. So here I configured or I installed KaaS on OpenStack, so that's why you can only see OpenStack provider. But if you install KaaS on AWS, or if you install KaaS on bare metal, you will have the proper provider for that, right? In the future, we will have the ability through one single KaaS system to deploy on multiple providers. Okay, so this is roadmap. To avoid filling in all the data, I will just upload the OpenStack RC file. So I have it here. So that's my clouds.yaml file. The only thing I need to do is to put a password here and then create the credential, right? So that's the only thing I will need to do when creating that namespace. And as an admin, I will then assign users, developers, to get the right access to that given namespace, so that when the developer log in to KaaS, they will then be able to access the proper namespaces and then consume resources within that namespace. Okay. So let's see how to use a namespace then, how to consume resources within that namespace. So I will be using my OpenStack private tenant. As you can see here, I already have a cluster running. The cluster is having 3 master nodes, 2 worker nodes. I am using a Kubernetes version, which is 1.14.8. And yeah, I will explain a little bit what are the different resources within that cluster. But let's create a new cluster. Okay, so to create a new cluster, I click on the create a new cluster button. Again, I give it a name. Here I can select the OpenStack credential that is linked to that namespace. So by default, it will select the one that you have created when you create the namespace. You have the ability to select the version of Kubernetes that you want to deploy. So right now we support 2 versions of Kubernetes, 1.14.8 and 1.15.5. Please note that as we will be updating the KaaS management system automatically in the background, you will, in that case, get these new Kubernetes releases, and you will have the ability then to update your cluster automatically or manually. Okay. You also have the ability, when you are creating a new Kubernetes cluster, to select some meaningful add-ons. Right now, we are providing Istio, Harbor, Stacklight as meaningful add-ons. So to enable them, you only need to select these options or unselect these options, right? So let's select these options. The SSH key is the SSH key pair that will allow you to connect to the Kubernetes nodes if you need to connect to these nodes to do some troubleshooting. Okay. In the provider tab, this is related to the target environment. So here in the OpenStack Cloud, the only thing that you will need to do is to select the external network if you want north-south communication, and then the DNS namespace server. Okay. By default, KaaS probe your Kubernetes, your OpenStack tenant, and retrieves all this information, right? So you will have this pre-populated, but you can always select another one if you have created another one, right? So for example, if we look at the OpenStack pod, if I check the network, you can see here that I have two networks that are tagged as external, right? Public and RJ in public. So basically, this is what KaaS will be retrieving and will provide you as options. Okay, so you have some default, but you always have the ability to select them when creating the cluster. The same for the Kubernetes part. So what are the different options you will be able to configure for Kubernetes, for the Kubernetes parameters? Basically, three network CIDR, the node CIDR, the services CIDR, and the pod CIDR, right? You usually don't need to change them. The node CIDR relates to the OpenStack private network scope. Okay, the rest are internal to Kubernetes, so it's going to be managed by Kubernetes. So yeah, you don't really need to change them. And the last item is Stacklight. So Stacklight, again, is the logging, monitoring, and alerting system. Here you will have the ability to enable or disable Stacklight. Multi-server mode is highly available Stacklight mode. So you will have multiple replicas of Prometheus or Elasticsearch, right? So you can select it or unselect it. You have some parameters around the persistent volume that will be used by Stacklight to save the logs or to save the metrics, right? So you will have the ability to manage the retention time and the size of the PVC. Same for Prometheus. You can configure Watchdog alert, and you have some alerts also that you can enable, whether you want email alert or Slack alerts. Okay. Once you have configured the different parameters for your cluster, you just need to create the cluster, and that's it, right? So your cluster object is now set. The only thing that you will need to do now is to add machines to this cluster. So to add machines to this cluster, you click on the newly created cluster, and then you add machines. Okay. So we define two types of machines. We define master nodes, and we define worker nodes. Okay. So when you will be creating machines, the control plane button here will allow you to select whether it's a master node or it's a worker node. Okay. Again, on the OpenStack provider, KaaS will be providing predefined data parameters around flavors, images, and availability zone. So these are some of the defaults that you can define when you deploy KaaS, but you can select other flavors, right? So if you want a bigger flavor, if you want a smaller flavor, you can select it here for your Kubernetes nodes. If you want another image, so let's say you want an updated version of Ubuntu, you can select that updated version of Ubuntu. And then if you want to select some specific availability zone, you can also select some specific availability zone, right? So here in that case, I have only one availability zone, but it will allow you to select your the availability zone you have within your OpenStack tenant. Okay. So let me create a first master node and a first worker node. Okay. So as you can see, KaaS allows you to enforce some deployment patterns, right? So if you want to enforce highly available environment for production, or you want to enforce secure environments in a repeatable way, through KaaS, you have the ability to enforce these patterns. Okay, so here what we have done in this install is that we are enforcing the highly available pattern. So KaaS will not deploy any cluster which doesn't fit with that minimum requirement. So that minimum requirement is 3 master node and 2 worker node. The reason we have this is to have highly available Kubernetes clusters, so that when we do the updates and upgrade of the cluster, we do it with no service disruption or with minimum service disruption. Okay. So the only thing that I need to do now to start the deployment is just to add 2 more master nodes and 1 more worker node. Right. And as from there, KaaS will start deploying that Kubernetes cluster. Okay. So we will not wait until that cluster is created. What I will be doing now is I will be showing how to use that that Kubernetes cluster, the Kubernetes cluster that I already created. Okay. So what I showed during this first lesson is how to access KaaS. So you have the UI to access KaaS, but you also have the Kubernetes APIs that you can use to access KaaS. So basically, it's kubectl with a kubeconfig for the KaaS management system, and then you can run a couple of commands. Let me show you how it's done. Actually, I can show it here. So on that cluster, I'm going to connect to okay. So Kubernetes. So KM is just an alias for kubectl with kubeconfig and the KaaS kubeconfig file, and I can then get, for example, get namespaces. Okay, so you can see here that I have when I do kubectl get namespaces, I can see the namespaces that I created. So the OpenStack private tenant namespace and the demo namespace that we just created. I just created 11 minutes ago, right? So you can have the ability also to interact with KaaS through the Kubernetes APIs, right? Because KaaS is a Kubernetes lifecycle management system. We also saw how to what is a namespace and how to create a namespace. And the last item we saw during this part is how to create a Kubernetes cluster within that namespace and how to enable various add-ons within that namespace. Okay. So for lesson 2 is now how to use that child Kubernetes cluster that was created by KaaS. So what we'll be seeing is, one, how to what are the different UI resources you have when you deploy KaaS. When you deploy a child Kubernetes cluster and you have enabled various add-ons. How to download a kubeconfig file so that you can then interact with that Kubernetes cluster. Then we will be using Istio, with Kali, Helm, and kubectl to deploy the book info sample app. And then while we are using that book info sample app, we'll also show how in parallel we can update and expand the cluster while having all the cluster being available and the application being still available. Okay, so no service downtime or minimum service downtime while doing the day-to operations like updating or expanding the cluster. Okay. So let's look at what are the different UI resources. So if you click on the information cluster information button for your running Kubernetes cluster, we have a list of available resources that we provide, right? So if, for example, you enabled Harbor, you will have the Harbor UI that will be available here. If you enabled Kubernetes dashboard add-on, you will also have the Kubernetes dashboard add-on, which is, sorry, and let me just, which is also available here. Okay. One thing to note is that KaaS is using Keycloak to federate identity across the different systems, right? So when the admin create the developer account, that same account will be used by the developer to connect to KaaS, but also to connect to all the resources that are created within the allocated namespaces. Okay, so the same credential will be used to download the kubeconfig file, right? So this is how you will be downloading the kubeconfig file for that Kubernetes cluster. But the same credentials will be used to access all the different resources that are configured within that Kubernetes cluster. Like, for example, Kubernetes dashboard that you can see here. To log into that Kubernetes dashboard, you will be using the same credentials as what the admin team provided you to access the KaaS system, right, as a developer. Okay. The same applies for example, Grafana, right? I want to access Grafana. So I will be logging in Grafana using the same credentials. Okay. So once you have access to Grafana, you have the ability to access some of the predefined dashboards that we provided. Like, for example, if you want to check the Kubernetes pod running in your in the cluster, you then can see a couple of pods that are being managed by the Kubernetes cluster. Like, for example, here I'm checking the alerter system, the alerter pod, but you have other pods that you can also monitor, right? Whether it's predefined pods that KaaS is managing, or also pods that you are yourself deploying, right? So here, these are all the different pods that KaaS have deployed, like Istio, like Harbor, like Grafana, FluentD. So all of these pods have been deployed by KaaS when you selected the proper add-ons. But you will see when I will deploy the Bookinfo application, these pods will also be available in this dashboard. Okay. So you have a couple of predefined dashboards that we provide here. Okay. The same for Prometheus. You have the ability then to then run the different Prometheus PromQL commands. Okay. So here are using the cluster info, you will have the ability to then get, of course, information about your cluster, like for Stacklight, the retention time and the retention size and the size of the PVC, right? And also the UI resources for that you have enabled for when you have deployed the Kubernetes cluster. Okay. We've also saw how to download the kubeconfig, and once I have downloaded the kubeconfig, I just need then to use standard kubectl/helm commands to then manage applications on top of my inside my Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so let's do this. Again, here I'm using an alias, so KC, which is Kubernetes kubectl with a proper kubeconfig file, and what I will be doing is I will be, okay, let's first start by checking the cluster. So if I do Helm list, you will see all the charts that I'm managing using Helm. So here I have Harbor, I have Istio, Kubernetes dashboard, and Stacklight, which are managed by Helm charts. Okay. So if I want to look at, or I'm doing a Helm list within the Istio namespace, you can see that I have Istio in that namespace, right? And then the last thing I want to check is all the pods within the kube system namespace, and you have a couple of the standard pods that are running within that kube system namespace. And the one that I'm interested in is the Tyler one for Helm, to manage the Helm chart. Okay. So now we've seen that we have Helm and we have Istio. The thing that I will be doing is I will configure Istio. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing root injection in the default namespace. Okay, so now you can see that in the default namespace, the sidecar, Istio sidecar will allow to add the proper rules within that namespace. Okay. I'm also going to delete the default mesh policy for simplicity. And as from there, I can then deploy my sample book info application. And how I will be doing this is I will be using standard kubectl command, right? So again, it's a pure play Kubernetes cluster. So we don't change standard Helm charts. We don't change standard manifest. You can consume, harden, do your own standard Helm charts and manifest to deploy applications inside these Kubernetes clusters, right? So again, open standard APIs so that it allows you then to port your application from one cluster to the other, okay? So here you can see that I'm going to kubectl the different Istio manifest, and then deploy the actual pods, right? So book info is made of multiple microservices. So it's a product page with some details, with free versions of reviews and rating of the product. Okay, changed. Okay, so I can then check the status of the deployment. So here you will see that I'm deploying the different microservices with 2 replicas. So you have 2 replicas of the detail microservice, 2 replicas of the product microservice, and then 2 replicas of the different other microservices like ratings, reviews, version 1, version 2, and version 3. Okay. I just need to wait for the different pods to be ready, right? And then we'll see how these services are being exposed. Oh, actually, I can already do this here. So let's see how services are being exposed. So if I do a kubectl get service in the Istio namespace, you can see that I'm exposing 2 services through load balancer type, right? So the first one is the ingress gateway, and the second one is the KaaS. Okay. So when you are doing this, KaaS is then requesting resources from the underlying environment. So, for example, if it's on AWC, it will use the Elastic load balancer service. If it's on OpenStack, it will use the Octavia load balancer system. If it is on bare metal, it will use Metal LB load balancer system. Okay. So, for example, here for Kiali, as I have, I'm exposing that service through the load balancer type. I have an IP, which is a floating IP, OpenStack floating IP, basically, which is allocated to an Octavia load balancer instance, right? So if I check here, load balancers, you will see that I have also date, yes, check policy. Yes, you will see that I have a couple of oh, that's very strange. Yeah, you will see that I have a couple of load balancers that have been created and managed by KaaS, and as from there, the services are being exposed by the Kubernetes-as-a-Service. Oh, sorry, child cluster, Kubernetes child clusters. Okay. So if I connect to this URL on this port, I will have access to the, actually I will have access to the Kiali dashboard. Okay. Let me select the default namespace. All right, so for now it's still empty. I will then do some traffic animation at some point, and then yeah, the default namespace. I can then also check Kiali is 91. Yes, 91. No, sorry, 87. Okay. This is still empty now. Okay, so this is running. And then at some point, I will also get Kiali to manage these pods. Before I start doing any traffic on my product page, let me just get the floating IP for the Istio ingress gateway. Okay. Just to check that my book info pod service is available, and you can see here that the product page is available. You have the summary, some details, and then the review microservice, which is managed. Okay, so if I update it, you will see that you have multiple versions of the review. So this relates to review 1, review 2, and review 3. Okay, and here now Kiali is now managing the services, right? So you will have the ability to see to do some telemetry on your micro on the pod, on the services that you are deploying on Kubernetes cluster. Okay. The last thing I will be showing here is now let me siege that service, and the way that I'm going to siege that service is let me just show you how it works. So here, if we look at the OpenStack tenant network topology, my cluster is running in that private network, and I have deployed a virtual machine in that other private network, and I'm going to siege my product page from that VM towards one of the container pod running within that child Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so to do so, I will connect to that virtual machine. Okay, and I will just siege that that page. Okay, so I will just get the URL here, and I can now siege that page. Okay, so I'm just connecting or creating multiple connections to that page. And you can see the animation actually in KaaS. Okay. So now you can see that, yeah, you have traffic being managed by Istio, and you have some telemetry capabilities provided by Istio to monitor your different services. And if you kill one pod or kill one microservice, you will have the ability here to see the issues with some of the issues you have for the service that you are providing, right? While I'm doing this, I'm also going to update the cluster. Sorry, it's here, right? So I'm going to update the cluster. I just need to click on the update button, and here you will see that KaaS will start updating the cluster. Okay, and I can also in parallel expand my cluster. So to expand my cluster, I just need to add more worker nodes. Let's say I want to add 2 more worker nodes, and now then create 2 more worker nodes. Okay, and all of this while my while my server, my service is being sieged. Okay. So what have we seen in this session? We saw how to access the different UI resources for the Kubernetes cluster, how to download the kubeconfig file and then use that kubeconfig file to install applications, whether it's through Helm or kubectl. We also saw while we are using the cluster that we have the ability to update the cluster and to expand that cluster, right? With minimum/no service disruption. It also depends on how you are deploying that your application, right? So you need multiple replicas and you need to manage a couple of things for your application to reduce that service disruption. Okay. The idea button. So we have a nice feature on the KaaS UI, which is the idea button. And that new idea button allows you actually to interact with our product team. So by clicking on the new idea button, you have the ability to provide ideas or bugs, if you see any bugs, or provide feedback on the product, so that we then have the ability to steer the roadmap and improve the product, right? So the whole process is you create that feedback through the idea button, and then one of the product guys will get back to you and provide feedback on what you are requiring, or some other support requests that you are finding in. Okay, so yeah, please feel free to use that new idea button. This is something which is very important for us also, to have the ability also to improve the product in a continuous way. The last thing I want to add before we start the Q&A is, yeah, we are offering through this webinar a 15% discount on all our Kubernetes training. So we have 3 Kubernetes training. The first one is KD100. It's a 2-day online training where you will learn how to learn Docker, learn Kubernetes, how to deploy, run, and manage containers, right? KD200 is a 3-day training where it's a little bit, yeah, more complete training with preparation for the CKA exam. And then the KD250 is, yeah, our most popular one. It's a combination of KD100 and KD200, again with a preparation for the CKA exam. So it's a 4-day training, right? So you have the coupon code here. You can log in on the training.mirantis.com resource, use that discount coupon, and select the training that you want to use. Okay. So thank you very much. Hope it was useful for you today. Here you can see some of the resources to download the free trial, to download the slides. We will be sharing through mail the recording and slides later this